fashion industry, it's really crazy. It's really glorified way of saying like, I'm going to throw this away. Basically just threw away 11% of my merchandise, but I'm getting a lot of the dollars back. During COVID, it became really difficult for brands to manage their inventory. I think the brands are finally seeing like, I need to at least digitize what's going on during my damage out process. About 92% of the items we get totally gets pre-approved. We're protecting the brand's margin.
Origin。大家好，这里是 Origin 可持续进化论，是由 Origin 研究所出品的一档播客节目，我是所长一佳。那在节目开头的时候呢，想问大家一个问题啊，其实大家不知道想没想过呢，我们全世界每年呢要浪费或者说扔掉多少的没穿过的新衣服？其实呢我也不知道呢问题的答案啊，不过我们今天这位嘉宾呢会和大家呢去揭晓谜底。其实他之前呢有一个小的公告要说一下，就是这期节目是我们呢这档播客节目第一次呢全英文的采访，为了让大家可以更原汁原味的体验啊，我们决定了不加任何的配音。不过视频版上呢，大家可以看到呢都会有全文的翻译。另外感兴趣的朋友呢，还可以通过我们的微信公众号 Origin 研究所获得呢全篇的翻译中文稿啊。好了，就到这里了。那下面就要请出我们今天的嘉宾，就是 Hemster 的创始人 Allison Lee。他想解决的问题呢，就是服装行业残次品的浪费问题。Hi Allison, so good to see you.
Hi Bianca, nice to see you too.
Allison, tell us how much waste is garment industry producing every year? How big is the problem?
It's really crazy because every part of like the fashion, including manufacturing, design, it's a bit prone to unnecessary like damages. So let's say like, for example, you imagine somebody cutting a pattern out of like a fabric, but like the leftover fabric cannot be used for anything else. So like all those scraps basically turn into unnecessary damages. But I think the offense gets even bigger when the units are actually done being manufactured. So let's say like fully manufactured dress, when we've already emitted like a ton of CO2 and water usage and all of that stuff goes into the distribution centers. And as you're buying something and you're trying something on the stores, or you've bought it from online and returning it, a lot of those manufactured units actually become unsellable throughout its like selling journey. So the studies are finding that about 11% of the fully manufactured items actually end up in landfill prematurely. And prematurely means that it's really going straight from the factory into the landfill because of very minor damages it's incurred throughout the distribution process.
What will happen to these wasted fashion items?
There are probably 4 different ways like the brands can try to deal with this currently. So you can try to recycle it, and because a lot of these units are probably synthetic, you can't really recycle it fiber to fiber anyway. So when you talk about recycling especially for garments, it really means shredding. It's not recovered as clothing. So that's like the biggest that's rather like the easiest way for someone to deal with that. And then the other side is they're like, oh, I'm going to donate this. But if you're donating damaged units that's not wearable, then all those units, right? Like when it gets received by the donation center, it gets thrown away. Like they don't have resources to repair it. So it's really glorified way of saying like, well, someone else can look at this. And then if it's not, usable, I'm going to throw this away. And then if the brand is, let's say, somewhat more luxury and they really care about the brand equity and they don't want to flood the market with this like second quality items, then some brands really decide to sort of destroy this and damage it even further on their factory floor. And then the fourth and the most common for ready-wear is you sell it to a importer offshore. And that's what's being hidden on the brand's P&L as a revenue line item, even though they're really selling it at a loss. So there is a bulk liquidation option, especially to offshore buyers. And that's when a lot of the units will go to somewhere like Kenya, but no one is really recycling them nor wearing them. It just gets into this like mountain of like secondhand apparel basically. And I think that's where a lot of the, developing countries are now saying like, we don't want to import these units anymore because we don't have a place to put this either.
What kind of environmental impact are these garment waste making?
These huge mountains, and those are just like tons and tons of landfill that should have been diverted from the get-go, but basically ending up in landfill, and they're not made to be biodegradable either.
You told me this is the problem you want to solve. Tell me a little bit about your company and what kind of solution it is providing.
So when we looked at this problem, I think there's two separate challenges. So number one is like the brands and warehouses don't understand what's in their damage boxes at all, because again, nothing is digitized. So we decided to empower them with a digitization tool that's like sort of AI powered, meaning like all you have to do is you don't have to be trained in inspection or anything like that. Any worker in their warehouse can start taking pictures of the unit with our Hemster app, and our app will basically like image recognize exactly what is wrong for this unit by comparing this to a stock photo. So we're saying something like, oh, the stock photo seems to have a belt, but this one doesn't have a belt. Where the brands are having trouble is it worth it for me to incur additional cost to fix it? So that's like the AI logic tree that we're building in terms of like, okay, what is your MSRP of this unit? So you're supposed to sell this for $200, but now it's off season of this unit, so it's gonna get 30% discount, and then we're gonna have to sell it on Poshmark, so it's on the additional 20% discount. So I can sort of calculate the selling price of this unit from the get-go, and I compare that to how much will this unit cost the brand for it to be a sellable quality again. So only when the margins make sense, we go ahead and basically perform the services, and by doing that, we're protecting the brand's margin. And the craziest part is, even with a very strict budget per unit, about 92% of the items we get totally gets pre-approved, meaning these are so minor damages, it's not gonna cost brands like $30-$40 to get it refurbished back to sellable goods. It's actually around like the low teens. So we actually understood that refurbishing has to deliver real profit back to the brands, and that has been the biggest challenge with the sustainability committees in fashion brands, because it's usually a cost center, but we really try hard to make it into a profit center.
Can you share how many brands your company Hemster is working with now?
So we have about 30 brands who are using they're using Hemster Revive as their monthly disposition channels.
Wow, interesting. I want to learn more in details. So for example, I have a company called Bianca's Clothes, and my company want to work with Hemster. Tell us what's gonna really happen.
So normally the brands will be sitting on ton of backlog. So they're like, oh, I was going to do a sample sale, or I was going to donate this, but that usually becomes our pilot, because we need to look at your units and your SKU library and understand like, oh, how would we refurbish these things? So we build out an SOP throughout the pilot, and that's where we understand like, okay, we're going to try cleaning this way, we're going to try cleaning that way, and oh, for your fabric, this is actually like the best way to do this to get it back to the highest quality at the lowest cost. So that's where we build out this like AI model of like, okay, so for Bianca's Clothes, we should be cleaning these ways so that we can hit your margin goals. And then we'll actually test out our Hemster marketplace, which is like our integration with eBay, Poshmark, Vestiaire, Depop, where the refurbished goods can go to the secondary markets and see what kind of like ASP that you can garner from your customers or from like the secondhand buyers. So with those data sets collected, that's when we go into like, okay, this is how this disposition channel is going to look for you for the next 12 months. And we can give you a quite accurate like forecast of like, if you send me all your damages, you're actually going to be making, let's say, $50,000 every month or $75,000 every month. And that's where we can like really give you accurate like look into how you should be expecting our ROI coming in. So that usually takes probably like 90 days for us to go through the pilot and then go through this like evergreen conversation. And then once the evergreen starts, it's super easy. You're basically saying like, okay, I'm gonna get my ops manager to basically use your address instead of sending it to a recycler or sending it to a donation. So it's as easy as like, here's our address, just send it to us. And then we will build you a dashboard that shows you, hey, we got 50, like 1,000 units so far. This is the landfill that you diverted. This is a CO2 that you sequestered. So like we build you this like ESG dashboard as well.
Yeah. Also, I'm very curious, and you mentioned about producing profit for these fashion companies. Why the profit is so important? And also, does that mean it only makes sense for these high-end and middle-end brands to choose this type of service, or for economic or business reasons? It's less incentive for a company like H&M to chase that direction.
The ROI is definitely the strongest, like the higher, like the selling price is for that unit. But I actually think there's two sides to this. One is if the brands can sort of like invest a little bit more in their like individual manufactured units for it to be like durable and quality driven, hence a little bit more expensive, then yeah, like you should want to keep this like alive for as long as possible. So I think we're looking at brands who are interested in making their manufactured products last as long as possible. And sometimes the pricing is a good correlation to it, but it's usually like even, let's say Quince is one of our really amazing brand partners, but their sweaters are $50, but they're still interested in like, hey, I want to make sure my sweaters can live as long as possible. And I think that comes more from the brand ethos and less from the financial margin side. I think the biggest thing is like our brand buying into this mission of like, hey, I want to make sure every single unit that I produce is under my responsibility and I want to make sure it lasts as long as possible. And if the brands are not buying into it, then it doesn't matter what financial returns that I can like provide for them too.
Different clothes may have different problems. How are you guys solving all different kind of problems?
So I see the services as like a modular pieces that I can plug into our operational models. If we look at the material and we look at the damage type. So we're like, okay, cashmere, holes. That's a different repair needs than cotton, holes. So individual vendors that we find who are really good at this specific thing. So what you need is this like translation layer between the brand and these like individual artisans of like, hey, I have 10,000 units coming in from, let's say, Quince, but 500 of them need hand darning, 1,000 of them needs cleaning, blah, blah, blah. So like we sort it at our warehouse and then we find the vendors and artisans who are very good at that specific thing.
I see. So you don't directly hire people to fix these problems. You work with other vendors to have more flexibility. Yeah.
Right. It's just connecting the dots of like making sure like, oh, I see a lump here. And then there's like enough people, but it's very fragmented. So like, how do you make sure they are coming together to play well and also making sure like the brand feels good about it? Because the biggest challenge is they're like, I cannot afford to spend $50 on this. Will you just really, really make sure that the per unit cost meets my financial forecast? So there has to be additional layer of like, okay, who is making sure that this process will always generate profit for brands? And that's like the data-driven guardrails that we're building around this refurbishing flow to make sure like, hey, like I know that I can generate at least 5x on whatever you're spending on this. So I think those three things like have to come together, and the really only way to like make it work is like through tech and through data science.
Talking about the money part, how do you guys charge these fashion companies?
So first is, as it goes through like our refurbishing platform, we know exactly which services were rendered to individual units. So we can calculate their like total monthly invoice, but it's always less than what they have budgeted for, meaning like we tell them the max amount that we would charge and then we would always charge less than that. So we know that we're not like, disrupting their budgeting, for example. And then secondly, when the units are selling through our marketplace, then we take a rev share off of that too. So if the brands are like, I already have a sales channel, I don't need to use yours, then obviously we don't need to take a rev share on that. We just send the units back, or we can drop ship it for the brands. But if the brands are like, I don't really have a good place to like move this, then they can activate our open or closed marketplace, so they can like decide how much rev share that they can get from these units based on how open or how closed the marketplace can get.
I really like this concept. It's like triple wins. You're helping fashion companies to solve waste problem and make more money, and you are bringing business to these vendors, and your company is creating values and making money as well. You told me you have been working with 30 companies, more than 30 brands. I'm curious, what kind of feedback did you hear from them? Do they really make money from this type of service from Hemster?
They break even and start generating profit even after the pilot. And I think in addition to like just like a cool like a cash like profit that we're generating, but I think the next phase of this is going to be a lot around like looking at the ESG metrics that we're able to provide back to the brands, and kind of comparing that to the policies that's coming down the pike. Because I think they understand, like, of course it feels good for them to be like, oh wow, like I diverted so much landfill through this program, but how does this compare to the compliance that I'm supposed to like follow as a brand? And I think that's sort of like the last piece that we're starting to look at is, here are all the amazing results that we're able to deliver because you're refurbishing over doing anything else. And because you're doing this, you actually qualify and you're meeting all these compliance requirements from like the government, or even during like for your investors. Like, how do you report it back to the right stakeholders so that you know that you're following the right rules? So that will be kind of like the value add services that we're launching for Q2, Q3 like this year.
Sounds like it has been a problem for a while. Why do you think fashion brands just started to think about this problem?
A lot of the times the brand can write off their damages. So like if the units are damaged, they actually get their COGS back from the government through the tax write-offs. So there's a lot of financial vehicles that they can utilize so that they're not really feeling this like financial burden of like, oh my gosh, I basically just threw away 11% of my merchandise, but I'm getting a lot of the dollars back. So there isn't a lot of incentive around why should I fix it, because the insurance is covering it, the government is covering it. So financially, it was not enough burn for the brands to like want to prioritize this. And it only became more important maybe like in the last 3 years when the supply chain became really difficult for the brands to manage. Because before you could say, oh my gosh, 11% got damaged out, but I can just reorder my catalog from my manufacturer or my factories and it will get here within weeks. But during COVID, it became really difficult for brands to manage their inventory that way, because they would reorder and then that category would, or that catalog would not arrive back in the distribution centers for like 6 to 8 months, which means they've already lost that season. So they're like, oh no, like I actually can't afford to just like damage out these inventory left and right, because I might not get a chance to replenish this down the line. I think the brands are finally seeing like, I need to at least digitize what's going on during my damage out process, so I understand like what's contributing to the damages, and are these actually supposed to get damaged out, or should they try to get like service and repaired and clean and try to stay in the circularity like market for a bit longer.
I'm so curious. This has been for a while. What have the world been waiting for? I mean, were they waiting for the technology, for the problem to be solved, or for somebody like you to jump in and solve the problem?
I think this is an unknown problem for a lot of like the tech entrepreneur. Like, like you don't study computer science to think about, wow, what about garment waste? Like this is just like a very hidden problem, even within like the fashion industry, I think. So once I know I can figure out like the way to productize it and marry the tech into this because of my background, but that's coming in from like the software side. So I think it's already like not as very well known problem already, but also like, are there a lot of like tech background people who are looking to solve these problems? Like not really. So I think maybe that's why, it sort of, I just like stumbled onto it, and then I'm, starting to really, like get into this. But I think it's just like a lucky discovery.
We talked about the fashion companies side. Let's talk about the consumer side. What consumers' attitude towards these repaired clothes?
That's really a big like marketing and conversations that we want to spark like within the consumers too, of like thinking about where does your returns go? Where does your store try-ons go? Where do these displayed units go? Like these units all have to find a home at the end of the day. So I think telling the story of like, oh, did you know that this thing came from Soho store and then was damaged out and then came to us and then we fixed it and now it's in your hands, and by buying this unit you actually saved this much landfill. I think telling that story is really intriguing and exciting for the consumers, and we actually see a pretty high repeat purchase rate across our audience already, because they're like, oh, the quality is basically like new, but I get to purchase it at a discount from the brands that I love. So hopefully like the consumers themselves can see this as like a win as well. And I think we'll know more as we're going into like additional integrations with more sales channels too, because right now we're moving a lot of the units on like the eBays and like the Poshmarks of the world, where people are used to buying like used or secondhand or like collectibles. But I think our vision is like, can we bring this back to like normal retailers like Bloomingdale's or Nordstrom, where these were not post-purchase items that I'm refurbishing. This is like actually net new items that we're servicing to bring it back to the market. So I don't think it deserves to be only sold on used market. Like I think it should go back to like the first quality market with some discount, but that's going to be our sort of like upstream strategy coming into next year and the year after.
Interesting. What do you think about the potential of the refurbished clothing?
This category like just doesn't even exist right now. Like there's a lot of refurbished like electronics or like hard goods like that, but no one has really tried to create like a refurbished soft goods market. I think the closest anyone got is maybe like with Nike with their refurbished like shoes and sneakers program, but with apparel, like no one has really created this market before. So obviously, like I'm very hopeful and I'm very optimistic.
As a female founder, what did you learn after you get into this direction, getting to the sustainability?
I think, ever since we sort of like went head into the sustainability world, one thing that I find over and over again is I think people are looking for potentially like a silver bullet, like this one thing that's going to solve all their problems when it comes to like fashion industry with waste, and which like it just can't exist that way. And everyone just needs to make small steps at a time. And I think instead of like expecting really quick results, and I understand why we feel this like pressure to come up with silver bullet solution, because we're like, oh my gosh, 2030 is really quick, like it's gonna come right around the corner, and then what's gonna happen if we hit our climate like crisis mode at that point. So I feel like everybody is operating under this like crisis mode, but really like I think the change comes from like the bite-sized changes first. So when we offer refurbishing, why don't we start here? Or why don't we start with something that you can do today, and then we can build upon that like together in the next like 5 to 10 years.
Thanks, Allison. Thank you so much for sharing your stories and your insights. 和 Allison 聊了这么久啊，我的最大感受就是既对地球好，对环境好，也对商业好，那才是呢可持续生意真正可以可持续的关键。不知道大家听下来有什么对于服装产业浪费和 Hemster 这家公司的想法，也可以在留言区和大家一起讨论。而想要呢再去看一眼我们的 中文翻译稿的呢，欢迎呢去我们的微信公众号 Origin 研究所获取，而想听音频版的呢，可以在小宇宙、喜马拉雅、苹果 Podcast 等等终端平台呢去关注收听。而想了解更多和可持续相关的信息呢，则可以通过小红书、微博、抖音、Instagram 去关注我们的 Origin 研究所。感谢各位的收听和陪伴，我是所长宜佳，我们下期节目再见。